I think it's quite exciting that it's a term that has acquired a kind of currency. At the very beginning, when it was introduced, it was always necessary to engage in a rather long conversation explaining the meaning of the prison industrial complex. Of course, the resonances with the military industrial complex are what most people immediately think about. But as I think back, I remember that we were attempting to capture the globality of the organization of punishment, even as we were very specifically attempting to create a way to understand why it was that such huge numbers of people were in prison in the U.S., the racial disparities of the prison population, and at the same time, the decline of education, of healthcare, and so forth. I think what was so important about that term was that it moved us away from simply thinking about punishment or jails and prisons in isolation from everything else. And even though many of us in that movement had been doing work around prisons for decades, and initially very specifically around political prisoners, and I always like to point out that that without the aid of people in prison, we would not have been able to begin to craft a larger analysis of the role of the prison. And I'm thinking about George Jackson, who argued, back in the late '60s and the early '70s, that we needed to think not only about the prison as the site of political repression of people who were engaging in social justice activism in the so-called free world, but we had to try to begin to understand how that apparatus was key to the way racism functioned in our society. So there were a lot of questions that were questions, and many of them are still questions. But I think what was most important was precisely that it allowed us to ask questions, and it made people recognize that what they thought they knew, they really didn't know. And I think that as we try to move the conversation more toward abolition today, that posture of raising questions is what is most important about the way that the prison industrial complex as a concept has functioned. Mm-hmm.